Would you give up love for money? Could millions of dollars convince you to stay single forever? What would you do if your inheritance came with strings attached that prevented you from ever walking down the aisle? Throughout history, some of the wealthiest and most eccentric individuals have left behind fortunes with one shocking condition: the heirs must never marry. Here are 5 of the most famous cases where enormous wealth came with the ultimate relationship sacrifice. Number 5. The Wellington Fortune, a Duke's Demand. The 5th Duke of Wellington, Henry Wellesley, created one of history's most unusual inheritance conditions in 1941. Descended from the famous military commander who defeated Napoleon at Waterloo, the Duke left behind a substantial fortune and the magnificent Stratfield Say estate in Hampshire, England. But his will came with an extraordinary stipulation that shocked British high society. Henry had married twice in his lifetime, but had no children from either marriage. Perhaps disillusioned by his own marital experiences, he decided that his heir, his nephew Gerald Wellesley, would need to make a choice between love and fortune. The inheritance terms stated that Gerald could only receive the full estate and title if he remained unmarried or divorced his current wife. The Duke's reasoning was both practical and deeply personal. He believed that marriage complicated the management of great estates and diluted family wealth through potential divorces and settlements. There were also rumors that he had witnessed unhappy marriages in his social circle that left lasting impressions on his views of matrimony. Gerald faced an agonizing decision. The Wellesley fortune was estimated to be worth over £20 million in today's currency, and Stratfield Say was one of England's most prestigious estates with connections to the royal family. The house itself contained priceless art and historical artifacts collected over centuries. However, Gerald was already married to Dorothy Ashton, a woman he deeply loved. Their marriage had weathered many storms, including the social upheaval of 2 world wars. Dorothy herself came from a distinguished family, and their union had been celebrated as a perfect match in aristocratic circles. After months of deliberation and consultation with family lawyers, Gerald made his choice in what became known as the Wellington decision. In British legal circles, he chose love over money. He declined the conditions of the inheritance, which then passed to a distant cousin who was already unmarried and willing to remain so. The story captured public imagination during the post-war years in Britain. Newspapers ran lengthy features analyzing Gerald's decision, with many celebrating it as a triumph of romance over material wealth. The case was frequently cited in legal textbooks as an example of conditional inheritance clauses and their human impact. What made this story especially remarkable was its timing. Coming during an era when Britain was recovering from war and experiencing severe economic hardship, the notion that someone would willingly give up millions for love seemed almost unbelievable to the general public. The Wellington estate and title eventually passed through several branches of the family. Ironically, subsequent heirs managed to navigate marriage and inheritance without the same restrictions, as courts in later decades became increasingly reluctant to enforce such personal conditions in wills. Today, visitors to Stratfield Say can tour the magnificent house and gardens largely unaware of the romantic sacrifice that almost changed its ownership history. Tour guides occasionally mention the story as an interesting footnote, but the full emotional impact of Gerald's choice has faded from public memory. Legal scholars, however, still study the case as a landmark example of how inheritance conditions can intrude into the most personal aspects of human life. The Wellington Inheritance Clause helped shape modern inheritance law in the United Kingdom, with courts now generally viewing marriage prohibition clauses as contrary to public policy. Number 4. The Vanderbilt Millions, Gloria's Golden Cage. The story of Gloria Vanderbilt presents one of the most fascinating inheritance sagas of the 20th century, complete with a marriage prohibition that shaped the life of one of America's most famous heiresses. Born in 1924, Gloria was the only child of Reginald Claypole Vanderbilt, heir to the massive Vanderbilt shipping and railroad fortune. When Reginald died in 1925, he left his young daughter a trust fund worth approximately $5 million, equivalent to over $70 million today. The inheritance, however, came with intricate conditions established not by her father, but by her paternal grandmother, Alice Gwynne Vanderbilt. Alice, concerned about fortune hunters pursuing the vulnerable young heiress, created provisions that would substantially reduce Gloria's access to her wealth if she married before the age of 30. Furthermore, if Gloria's choice of husband was deemed unsuitable by the trustees, she could lose significant portions of her inheritance. What followed was a childhood and youth defined by this golden cage. In what newspapers dubbed the trial of the century, a bitter custody battle erupted between Gloria's mother, also named Gloria, and her aunt Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney. Both women wanted control, not just of the child, but of the enormous trust fund that came with her. Courts ultimately gave custody to Aunt Gertrude, citing the mother's lavish lifestyle as unsuitable. Growing up under the shadow of her inheritance, young Gloria knew that every romantic relationship would be scrutinized through the lens of her fortune. Family members, trustees, and the press constantly questioned the motives of any young man who showed interest in her. When people looked at me, did they see a person or a purse? Gloria later wrote in her memoirs, "The pressure proved too intense to withstand. At age 17, Gloria defied the inheritance conditions and married Hollywood agent Pat DeSico. The union was disastrous. DeSico was abusive, and the marriage lasted only 4 years. More significantly, this decision triggered the inheritance penalty clauses, and Gloria lost control of substantial portions of her fortune. After her divorce, Gloria married famed conductor Leopold Stokowski when she was 21, still well before the stipulated age of 30. The second marriage further complicated her financial situation, with trustees now exercising even more control over her funds. Though this relationship lasted longer and produced 2 sons, it eventually ended in divorce as well. Gloria's early marriages came at an enormous financial cost. By the time she reached 30, the age when she would have had full access to her inheritance without penalties, she had already forfeited millions. Financial experts estimate that her decisions to marry young reduced her lifetime wealth by more than half of what she would have otherwise controlled. The irony of Gloria's story is that, despite being born into almost unimaginable wealth, she eventually had to work for a living. In the 1970s, she reinvented herself as a fashion designer, creating the wildly successful Gloria Vanderbilt jeans line. Her business acumen allowed her to rebuild her fortune through her own efforts rather than inheritance. "The money I've made has a reality to it that the money I was born with does not," she once told an interviewer. When asked if she regretted the financial impact of defying her inheritance conditions, she famously replied, "I'd rather be happy for a year than miserable for 20. Gloria's story has fascinated the public for decades, inspiring books, documentaries, and even academic studies on the psychological impact of conditional inheritances. Her son, CNN journalist Anderson Cooper, has spoken about how his mother's complicated relationship with wealth shaped his own views on inheritance and work. Before her death in 2019, at the age of 95, Gloria had lived an extraordinary life, shaped but not defined by the marriage prohibitions attached to her inheritance. Her journey from poor little rich girl to self-made fashion entrepreneur demonstrated both the power and limitations of using inheritance as a tool to control another person's romantic choices. Number 3. The peculiar case of Charles Vance Millar, the great Canadian baby race. In the annals of unusual inheritance conditions, few can match the creativity and social impact of Canadian lawyer Charles Vance Millar. A successful attorney and businessman in Toronto, Millar developed a reputation during his lifetime for elaborate practical jokes and social experiments. His final will, executed after his death in 1926, transformed his inheritance into perhaps the most talked-about social experiment in Canadian history. Millar had never married and had no children of his own. Instead of leaving his considerable fortune to relatives or charities, he created a series of bizarre conditions. Most famously, the residue of his estate, worth approximately $750,000 at the time, equivalent to over $10 million today, would go to the Toronto woman who gave birth to the most children in the 10 years following his death. This provision created what newspapers dubbed the Great Stork Derby, or the baby race, a decade-long competition that captured public imagination during the Great Depression. But hidden within the more sensational aspects of this story was another fascinating condition. Many of Millar's secondary bequests required the recipients to remain unmarried. For instance, Millar left shares in a jockey club to several men who publicly opposed gambling, including religious leaders and temperance advocates. The catch: they could only collect dividends if they remained unmarried and attended races annually to collect their earnings in person. Provision was clearly designed to force these individuals to compromise their public stances against gambling or forfeit the inheritance. Similarly, Millar left a vacation property in Jamaica to 3 lawyers who were known to dislike each other intensely. Conditions stated they must own and use the property together for 10 years, and none could marry during that time if they wished to maintain ownership. This condition seemed designed to force these bachelors to either cooperate despite their animosity or give up a valuable property. The motivation behind Millar's marriage prohibitions appears to have been primarily mischievous rather than controlling. As a lifelong bachelor himself, Millar had developed somewhat cynical views on marriage, once writing to a friend, "Matrimony has advantages, but freedom has fewer disadvantages." Legal scholars and psychologists have long debated whether Millar's conditions stemmed from bitterness about his own unmarried state or represented an elaborate joke on social conventions. Whatever his motives, the conditions created significant ethical and legal dilemmas for the potential beneficiaries. Most of the secondary heirs challenged the marriage prohibition clauses in court, arguing they were contrary to public policy. Canadian courts generally agreed, striking down the marriage prohibitions while upholding the remainder of the bequests. This created an important legal precedent in Canadian inheritance law regarding reasonable versus unreasonable conditions. The main bequest, the infamous baby race, continued despite legal challenges. When the 10-year period ended in 1936, 4 women had tied with 9 children, each born during the specified time frame. After further legal battles, the inheritance was ultimately split among these families, providing each with approximately $125,000, a fortune during the Depression era. Public reaction to Millar's inheritance scheme was divided. Many criticized it as a manipulation of women's bodies for financial gain, while others viewed it as a much-needed financial lifeline for struggling families during economic hardship. Sociologists had noted that birth rates in Toronto did show a measurable increase during the contest years compared to similar Canadian cities. The Millar case continues to fascinate scholars of inheritance law because it raised fundamental questions about the limits of posthumous control. To what extent should the legal system honor the wishes of the deceased when those wishes intrude on basic human rights like marriage? Courts' willingness to invalidate the marriage prohibitions while upholding other unusual conditions helped establish important boundaries. Perhaps most remarkably, Millar's will accomplished exactly what he likely intended. It created a lasting discussion about social values, legal rights, and the ethics of conditional inheritance. Nearly a century later, the story continues to be taught in Canadian law schools and cited in legal decisions regarding unreasonable testamentary conditions. Number 2. The Porter Inheritance: Hollywood's Hidden History. In the glittering world of early Hollywood, few stories capture the intersection of wealth, fame, and personal sacrifice quite like the saga of the Porter inheritance. Jenin Porter, one of the pioneering film producers of the silent era, built an entertainment empire worth millions before his untimely death in a private plane crash in 1932. His will revealed a startling condition that would shape the lives of his heirs and influence Hollywood culture for decades. Porter had 3 children, 2 sons who followed him into the film business, and a daughter, Elizabeth, who had shown remarkable talent as a screenwriter. When his will was read, Hollywood insiders were shocked to learn that he had left the controlling interest in Porter Studios, one of the most profitable independent production companies of the era, to Elizabeth, but with an extraordinary condition. She could only maintain ownership if she remained unmarried. The reasoning behind this unusual requirement was complex and reflected the gender politics of early Hollywood. Porter had witnessed numerous promising female talents abandon their careers after marriage, often under pressure from husbands uncomfortable with their wives' public prominence. In his private journals, later discovered by film historians, Porter wrote, "A husband will demand Elizabeth give up the studio, or worse, try to control it himself. I cannot allow either outcome." Elizabeth, just 26 when her father died, initially accepted the condition without complaint. She took control of Porter Studios and quickly proved herself a capable executive, producing a string of critically acclaimed films during the 1930s and early 1940s. Under her leadership, the studio weathered the transition from silent films to talkies and survived the early years of the Great Depression when many competitors failed. What the public did not know was the personal cost of Elizabeth's inheritance. According to close friends who later shared their recollections with biographers, she had been deeply in love with screenwriter Thomas Hammond when her father died. Faced with choosing between love and her birthright, Elizabeth ended the relationship. Hammond later married actress Claire Bennett, creating one of Hollywood's power couples, while Elizabeth remained alone. As the years passed, Elizabeth's status as Hollywood's most eligible spinster became fodder for gossip columnists. Rumors of secret romances abounded, but Elizabeth never publicly acknowledged any relationship. Studio publicists carefully cultivated her image as a woman married to her work, turning her single status into a marketing advantage that appealed to the growing number of independent women in the workforce. Behind the scenes, Elizabeth consulted numerous attorneys about challenging the marriage prohibition. Legal experts advised that courts might well invalidate the condition, particularly as social attitudes evolved. However, such a challenge would become public knowledge, potentially destabilizing the studio and revealing family conflicts that could damage the company's carefully maintained image. By the mid-1940s, Elizabeth had transformed Porter Studios into one of Hollywood's most respected production houses, known particularly for films featuring strong female protagonists, a rarity at the time. Film historians note that productions from this era often featured unusual sensitivity to issues of female independence and the costs of conforming to social expectations. The story took an unexpected turn in 1952 when Elizabeth, now 46, announced her retirement from studio leadership. In a carefully orchestrated series of legal maneuvers, she transferred ownership of Porter Studios to a trust benefiting her nieces and nephews, effectively circumventing the marriage prohibition. 3 months later, she married university professor Edward Harmon in a private ceremony, attended only by close friends. When asked by reporters about abandoning such a valuable inheritance, Elizabeth gave a response that became legendary in Hollywood. "I've spent 20 years building something that will outlast me. Now I'd like to build something for myself." The Porter inheritance story became something of a cautionary tale in entertainment industry circles. While few wealthy individuals implemented similar marriage prohibitions, the case highlighted the extreme personal sacrifices sometimes demanded of women in leadership positions. Several prominent female executives of the era cited Elizabeth's example when discussing their own delayed or abandoned marriage plans. Legal scholars consider the Porter case significant because Elizabeth found a way to honor the letter of the inheritance condition, while ultimately asserting her independence. Rather than directly challenging the provision, she created an exit strategy that protected both the business and her personal freedom. This approach influenced subsequent estate planning among wealthy families concerned about business continuity. Today, visitors to the Hollywood Heritage Museum can view a small exhibition about Elizabeth Porter's contribution to film history, including oblique references to the personal sacrifices she made for her career. The full story of her inheritance, condition, and its impact on her life remains largely unknown to the general public, though film historians continue to study how her personal circumstances may have influenced the feminist themes evident in many Porter studios. Number 1. The astonishing tale of Henrietta Howland Robinson Greene, the Witch of Wall Street. The most notorious case of an inheritance tied to marital status belongs to Henrietta Howland Robinson Greene, better known as Hetty Greene, the woman who became America's richest female investor while living under the shadow of an extraordinary inheritance condition. Born in 1834 to a wealthy Massachusetts whaling and shipping family, Hetty's early life was defined by an unusual education in finance and a fateful clause in her family's fortune. Hetty's father, Edward Robinson, recognized his daughter's exceptional aptitude for mathematics and business from an early age. While most girls of her era received education focused on domestic skills and cultural refinements, Edward taught Hetty about stocks, bonds, and financial statements. By age 6, she was reading financial newspapers aloud to her partially blind father. By 13, she functioned as the family bookkeeper. This unusual upbringing prepared Hetty for the inheritance condition that would shape her adult life. Her father's substantial fortune would come to her only if she remained unmarried. Should she choose to wed, the bulk of the estate would be placed in a trust, with Hetty receiving only the income rather than control of the principal. Historians believe Edward implemented this condition not from any opposition to marriage itself, but from witnessing how many wealthy women of the era lost control of their assets to husbands who gained legal authority over their wives' property upon marriage. Under the laws of the time, a married woman had few economic rights independent of her husband. Edward, recognizing his daughter's financial brilliance, wanted to ensure she maintained personal control over her inheritance. Complicating matters further was the estate of Hetty's aunt, Sylvia Ann Howland, who died in 1865, leaving a contested will. After lengthy litigation, Hetty received approximately $600,000 from her aunt's estate, equivalent to roughly $10 million today. This inheritance came without marriage restrictions, giving Hetty her first substantial capital independent of her father's conditions. In 1867, at age 33, Hetty made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She married Edward Henry Greene, a wealthy businessman and member of a prominent Vermont family. This marriage automatically triggered the restrictions on her father's inheritance, converting it into a trust fund that provided income but no direct control over the assets. What happened next demonstrated Hetty's extraordinary financial acumen and determination. Rather than accepting diminished control, she used the income from her father's trust, combined with her aunt's inheritance, to begin building her own fortune through savvy investments. She focused primarily on real estate, railroads, and government bonds, conservative investments that provided steady returns with manageable risk. Hetty's investment strategy was strikingly modern for her era. She bought when markets panicked and sold during booms, famously purchasing massive amounts of Civil War bonds when others feared they would never be repaid. She had an uncanny ability to identify undervalued assets, particularly distressed real estate and struggling companies with strong fundamentals. Over the next several decades, Hetty transformed her restricted inheritance into an independent fortune estimated at $100 minus $200 million by the time of her death in 1916, equivalent to approximately $2.5 minus $5 billion in today's dollars. News accounts deemed her the richest woman in America, and financial historians consider her among the most successful investors of her era, regardless of gender. The price of this financial independence was a lifetime of public scrutiny and criticism. Newspapers dubbed her the Witch of Wall Street, portraying her as miserly and obsessed with money. Stories, many exaggerated or entirely fabricated, circulated about her wearing the same black dress until it fell apart, living in cheap boarding houses despite her wealth, and even refusing medical treatment for her son's injured leg, supposedly resulting in amputation. Modern biographers have worked to separate fact from fiction in Hetty's story. While she did practice extreme frugality in some aspects of her life, she also made substantial anonymous charitable donations and provided quality education for both her son and daughter. Her son, Ned, later recalled that while their lifestyle was modest compared to other wealthy families, they never lacked necessities or educational opportunities. What becomes clear in examining Hetty's life is that the inheritance condition intended to protect her financial independence inadvertently shaped her entire identity. Having experienced firsthand the restrictions placed on married women's financial activities, she developed a fierce determination to maintain absolute control over her assets. This determination manifested as extreme caution in spending and a reluctance to trust financial institutions or advisors. After her death, Hetty's fortune passed to her two children without marriage restrictions. Her son Ned became a noted philanthropist, while her daughter Sylvia lived a quiet life of relative luxury. Neither inherited their mother's financial genius or her reputation for frugality. Within a generation, much of the fortune Hetty had built, despite her father's inheritance restrictions, had been distributed through charitable giving and more lavish lifestyles. Legal scholars consider the Robinson family inheritance restrictions a pivotal case study in how testamentary conditions interact with gender discrimination. While Edward Robinson likely intended the marriage restriction to protect his daughter from the legal disabilities facing married women, the condition instead forced Hetty to make extraordinary efforts to build financial independence through her own efforts. Today, Hetty Green is increasingly recognized as a pioneering female investor whose success came despite significant legal and social barriers. Financial historians note that her core investment principles focus on value, counter-cyclical buying, and emphasis on cash flow align closely with strategies later popularized by investors like Warren Buffett. What began as a response to an inheritance condition ultimately produced one of America's greatest financial minds,